Bene, buonasera a tutti, eccoci qui con il terzo appuntamento della terza giornata degli EV Pro Days. Siamo qui con Wojciech Setlak, writer e narrative designer presso lo studio polacco 11-Bit Studios. Wojciech ci parlerà dell'esperienza di This War of Mine, che è un survival game basato sull'assedio di Sarajevo. Il gioco viene utilizzato come supporto didattico in Norvegia. È stato anche recentemente inserito nel programma scolastico in Polonia. Welcome, Wojciech. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much for having me.
As you wrote in your abstract, video games have no less potential to influence opinions than other forms of expression. So it's important to ask ourselves what values should they convey and how should they do it. And I think this is the main question of your lecture. So I give you the floor and thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with you today. And as Andreas said, I'm a writer and narrative designer with 11-Bit Studios, a Polish independent games company. And I started working there when the company was starting the development of This War of Mine, the game which made it famous. This is a game about civilians, the fate of civilians in a war. And we will talk more about it in a moment. But first, I would like to invite you to reflect on something that many people playing the games, I think most people playing computer games, and many people who make them don't put much thought into, which means what exactly is that we share with others when we make our games and also when we play them. And to this, I will. I want to share my screen with you. Writing with foresight. This is a bit what we should think forward when we make our games. We should try to see the future in a way. And the games, although many of them are about the future, very often fail to do this. This is. Our company became famous because we always took the position that it's most interesting when we do things differently. When we try to innovate, and starting with the Anomaly games, which were before I joined the company, and with This War of Mine and with Frostpunk, we always try to do things a bit differently, and this is what brought us success. So, as you probably would agree, the games are no longer toys for children. Most of them aren't, actually. They have grown out, but they are no longer even toys for adults. They have grown out of their niche and entered the mainstream. It brings with this success of games brings with itself a certain responsibility, because games like books and movies are now part of the global culture, and they influence our society. This is big, you know. On one hand, it's of course obvious because games are part of our culture. Our society is in a way an emanation of our culture, or the other way around. So it's obvious that games are influencing our society, but we need to remember that young people in particular are prone to looking into games for inspiration, for how to look at the world. And this gives games great power, and with great power comes great responsibility. And that brings me to my point that it burdens us as game creators with the responsibility to look to the future, not to the past, because we need to think when making our games about people who will be playing them and the kind of message that we convey in them, because it will it will be a part of their formation. So in a way, games have accrued a debt to the society which they have to repay. This is something that many of my colleagues would find well, controversial, so to say, because all creators want to be completely free in what they create. But in case of games, you see, they are a bit different than books or, well, more like films. But books are written usually on the local market. It's not very often that a book like Elena Ferrante books, which are initially they were very, very Italian. They are, of course, but they succeeded globally. But usually books are really local, films less so, especially in Hollywood. But games from the outset are created for the global market, to sell everywhere, in India, in the United States, in Italy, in Poland, everywhere, in China. All those different cultures, different people, they are supposed to buy our game. So we, the game creators, usually want them to understand everything that we have to say. So we very often rely on the most often overused parts of our global culture, because we want the things that everybody will understand. So we rely on the most overused motifs and tropes very often. Not always, of course, but quite often. Which means that games use the so-called common denominator, but very often it is the lowest common denominator. We appeal to the base principles, base instincts, kill or be killed, being the most obvious. So when trying to speak to everybody, we are in danger of reinforcing stereotypes, of looking at everything through the same set of prejudices. So the result is that games, paradoxically, because games are the newest form of entertainment, but games are quite conservative. So there is nothing wrong with being conservative, okay? I'm not conservative, but I have some of my friends are, and they are fine people, and this is not something wrong in itself, but games should reflect the whole of society. They shouldn't have a conservative slant, and they have. The portrayal of violence in games is very close to the very, very old tropes. So we need to do something about it, we, the game creators. So our task is to watch out for stereotypes. Don't use stereotypes, because all stereotypes are harmful, even the positive ones. Even you can say, what's wrong with a stereotype of heroic firefighter or heroic doctor who sacrifices themselves to save people? It's a stereotype, of course, but it's a good one. It's an ideal, you can say, something that we should strive for. But if we use an ideal as not as something to strive for, but something to use to describe reality, we are making a false image of the world, because ideals are very rarely walking this earth. So if we look at this heroic firefighter or heroic doctor and we see only the stereotype. We are not seeing them as they are usually, because stereotypes are rare in real life. So we should strive not to use them in our games. And the most difficult part of today's presentation for me was the question, what values should we express? And the answer is very simple, actually. Your values. You should always express your values, because otherwise you are becoming a propagandist. Of course, the one thing that I would like to appeal for is to look forward to the future, and try not to repeat what's been done, but encourage in your audience, encourage so-called soul searching, the reflection. So don't show them something that they know, or if you do, always use a twist, because it provokes people to think about, why did I do this? Why did I make this choice? It was so. Avoid obvious choices. Innovate and experiment. Of course, it's kind of obvious. It flows from this. It is said that innovation is risky, but our company has built its prestige and its position on innovating, on being different. So we should strive to look into the future and bring the games into the 21st century, not just technically, but with shedding the old stereotypes. And how to do it, I will talk in a moment about our game, This War of Mine, and perhaps shortly about Frostpunk and how we did it. But I would like you to look at this phrase and remember this. It's that this speaks to the enormous power of games, educational power that they have. If you tell me something, I can forget it. If you show me, I might remember. But if you involve me in doing, if I do, then I will learn. Nobody knows who said this, but not Benjamin Franklin. Perhaps some ancient Chinese, but well, those are wise words, and we making games should remember them. But we should also remember, as bad book will not be read, and bad movie will not be watched, bad game will not be played. So our game, with which we want to convey those values that we so highly keep in such a high esteem, it has to be playable. It has to be a good game that people want to play. And This War of Mine is a good game. It might not be fun, but people agree that it can be played. So another facet of this is that we might overdo this, which means try to convey too much with our game, which might be too simple, and we came out sounding insincere, and this breaks everything. We should always fit our means to our message, and if we can't, we need to fit our message to our means. If we have just a simple game, we might want, but we better concentrate on a single message to convey with it, not a whole worldview. So we should avoid preaching, because it if we sound insincere, nobody will listen to us. If we sound like we are speaking from ex cathedra, our message won't go through. So the best way to make players think for themselves, to analyze their position, their choices, is to give them meaningful, interesting choices. This is generally good practice in the game design, but when trying to convey a message, it's best not to write it on the screen, but to show the consequences of us making a decision. This means giving people choices and presenting them with clear consequences of those choices. So, of course, I'm speaking from experience. How do we know that our games actually influence anybody? We always encourage feedback. We want to know what players think about us. So this is the whole, the drill. The social media, emails, online comments, but also conversations in face-to-face, which is harder to do now, and taking part in events and talking to people at events, not just, ex cathedra, but face-to-face. This gave us insight into what people actually think about our games, and those are some reactions. One guy in a conference told our programmer in 2014, shortly after This War of Mine was published, "Now I know what's happening in Ukraine." It was after Russia invaded the eastern Ukraine and took the Crimea from them. And those things, the people without asking, without encouraging, people wrote those things about our games, and this is how we know that at least some of them got the message. So I will now show you a piece of This War of Mine, which is a game about surviving a modern conflict. And to do this, I will have to, do this. One moment. Sorry, So this is This War of Mine, a game about the fate of civilians in a war. Playing it, we look after several ordinary people from all walks of life. Among them can be a journalist, a football star, a fireman, a warehouse worker, a teacher. They were brought together by fate when they took shelter in a half-ruined house during a prolonged siege during a civil war. And the goal of our game is simple: to survive this war. Survive until the war ends, and we don't know when this happens, because when the war breaks out, in reality, nobody tells us when is it going to end and what to do. So during the day, they have to stay inside this shelter to be safe from sniper fire. So they cook meals, try to tend to their physical and emotional wounds, and fix the shelter however they can. And so they can find some stuff initially in this ruin that they inhabit, but sooner or later they will have to venture outside. And this happens when the night comes. So in this setup, we have, this is the stuff that they can find. We have been inspired by the memoirs of the siege of Sarajevo and also of the Warsaw Rising in 1944. So when the night comes, they will have to venture outside to look for necessities, food, medicines, various supplies and materials, so they can survive a bit longer. But as the days go by, useful things become harder to find. So this what you can see here, this will be exhausted in the first day. So let's scroll forward a bit. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now we have to select where to go, which location to explore during the night, and as I said, as the go by, useful things become harder to find. So we will have to venture into more and more difficult and dangerous places. So many of those encounters force a difficult decisions upon us. We can meet just people like us, but of course we can rob them, we can assault them, and this is actually the easy way to win, to take from others. But more often than not, we can stumble upon the dangerous people, armed people like bandits or soldiers, and fighting in this game is difficult and dangerous. So we initially try to avoid it, but it's possible. So in one place we can meet a girl who is being assaulted by a soldier, and we can risk the life of our survivor, and perhaps the lives of all of them, to save her. But whether we should do it or not, the game will not tell us which is the right choice. This is what games usually do. There is a right choice and wrong choice in almost every situation. Here, it's unlikely that we will survive saving the girl. We can do the right thing, be the knight on the white horse, but usually our character will die, and the others who wait for food and medicines at home will be mourn this character and can become depressed, broken, and will go hungry and sick. So this is the example that I used. That I used during a presentation, during a lesson I made. Let me show you another. I'm sorry. So. Yeah. And this is from this will find the little ones, because we initially didn't include children in our game, because the idea was so novel. We had no idea whether it will actually sell. This War of Mine sold very well. For a week it was in the top 10, and for the first 2 days it was in the top 3 on Steam, and it was it was against Far Cry 4 and other 800-pound gorillas. So we have proved with this game that such difficult subjects are something that people want. People want play games that mean something, and this was a big victory for us. And we decided to do the little ones, which is the edition that includes children, because children are they are the most innocent victims of wars, and their lives are deeply affected by them. They are deprived of essentials when they need them most: the proper nutrition, education, safety, healthcare, friends and family. Their well-being is often the most important thing for their guardians. So the stories of children are very important part of every story about war. But we had to know first that our audience will accept the premise as such. So publishing this War of Mine, the little ones, we partnered with a foundation that finances schools and generally helps children in the war zones. So we helped a little. But generally, I must say that this game, the reception of this game has been much above our expectations. We knew that initially that the press was impressed, but we didn't have initially any idea whether people will want to play such a game. But the question was how to make a game that presents such a difficult, heavy subject and do it justice. Because it's easy to say that games are just another art form, a medium in which we can express ourselves. okay, and they can be used about they can be used to talk about the human condition, as like the dragon cancer showed. This dragon cancer, sorry. But how to make a game about war, which actually involves fighting, because it's inconceivable, hardly conceivable to make a game in which you are in such a situation and can't even defend themselves. How to do justice to this? So there are millions of people on this planet who, for whom such situation is not a fantasy; it's the lived reality. So we turned towards their stories for inspiration. We read the accounts of survivors on the Fama collection, the online museum of the Sarajevo siege and the Bosnian war. And we read many stories of survivors of the Warsaw Rising of 1944, the so-called oral history archives, which are written down from oral accounts. And what we learned, for example, for me as a writer, the lesson was that people talk about the most difficult and terrible things in a very simple language. So this is the language that he used in the game. So the inspiration, the price of inspiration was reading all those because I did a lot of the research, and I had to take a break after this, because no matter how bitter fate we imagined for our survivors, we were able to find historical examples of much worse, of real people suffering like that, and much worse. And there are many accounts which we didn't use in our game, because we decided that we can't subject our audience to all the reality, horrible reality of war. So we wanted to tell a story that will move people and help them see the world around them, and not draw them away from it. Because war games usually, almost invariably, are power fantasies. They tell the story of a guy with a big gun or a commander defeating mighty armies, and that civilians are just props, if they appear at all. And yet in modern warfare, the civilians are the ones who bear the cost of war. The price, they are unable to change its outcome. And for those who manage to stay alive, the price they have to pay for survival is often very high, and often paid even after the end of war. And in this war of mine, it's reflected in the fates of our survivors. If they had to do terrible things to survive, this causes trauma, psychological trauma to them, and the fate of our survivors after the war reflects what they went through. So, another thing that we decided to do to keep this game true was to keep it close to the lived experience of the survivors, to focus on the struggles and suffering and the little victories of our survivors. So we didn't set out to make a simulation. So we dismissed many technical details which, in our view, would drag the attention away from the survivors towards the technicalities. So the game that turned out from this is a difficult experience. It's both difficult as a game, but also as an emotional marathon. So, for example, initially, the player doesn't know what to do. And there is almost no help. They don't know where to send those little people on the screen, whether this stuff they find is valuable or worthless. and we didn't provide a tutorial or a manual, because when war breaks out, nobody hands out manuals. So we wanted to recreate this feeling of helplessness in the players, which is kind of antithetical to games, because you don't do this. You don't leave the player lost, because the players hate this. Players want to have agency. They want to have control. And in this game, they often don't. They don't have full control over the situation, and they are all quite often helpless to fix things. And yet, still, many people found this experience rewarding in a way, novel. So, if we have to fight, for example, fight is messy. Control is very difficult. Fighting is possible, but it's always unpredictable, and something rather to be avoided. Because people who we are trying to protect in this game are not fighters. There is one ex-military among them, and he can fight quite well. But the rest, they are just like, in reality, they have no idea what to do. So. Well, if the players figure out things for themselves and they feel a bit more confident, things are starting. The game gets more difficult, as it should be. Things are starting to get downhill. Robbers visit our home and rob us almost every night. We have to defend. Winter sets in. It's getting cold, so our survivors are getting sick. Food is becoming scarce, and so on, and it's very easy to fall behind, and our people that we are trying to save are getting depressed and broken, and they can even commit suicide, and we can't help it. In case of children, we made a exception, because no children die in this game. If things are very, very bad, they just live. They live in the night, and we learned that they were found in the street and saved. But this was something that we didn't. One of the things that we didn't want to burden our audience with. So, and this war of mine, when we were writing the game, we had no idea how far will it go, and we had no idea that one day it will be used in our schools in Poland as supplementary reading material, so-called. So in this case, playing material, but this is the first game to be included in the school curriculum. And of course, we are extremely proud. But 6 years ago, we could not know this, but because we put our minds into the future, we thought what people will think about this game, how they will react to this, what might happen if this is not just another little game, but something much bigger. By treating it seriously from the outset, we were prepared for what this game became. And this is part of writing with foresight. You not only try to project the needs of your future audience, but also what might happen to your little game if it suddenly becomes something much bigger. So our next game, which because I would like to talk for a moment about our next game, which is called Frostpunk, because in this case we already knew that we have an audience that wants to play difficult games which pose difficult questions. But even though we knew all this, Frostpunk was hard to make because it was, on one hand, it's entirely different. because it's a game about surviving a post-apocalyptic in a post-apocalyptic city, the last city on Earth. But at its core, it asks the same question as This War of Mine. In This War of Mine, the question was, what do you sacrifice to survive? What will you do to survive, and how much will it cost you? Well, in this case, your people, but of course the player puts themselves in the game. And so what will you do to survive? And what is the price of survival? And in Frostpunk, the question is the same, but the stakes are higher, because we might decide that I don't want to rob people, not to mention to kill people, to survive. Okay, I will starve to death. It's war, and I don't have it in me to what I think I have to do to survive. Okay, but in Frostpunk, you are responsible for an entire community. You are responsible, perhaps, for what remains of mankind, and the stakes are that much higher. And what will you do? How much of your initial setup of the society, where children are not allowed to work, and where eating people is generally frowned upon, how much of this normal society will you have to sacrifice to give those people a chance to live? The question is the same. The stakes are higher, and Frostpunk not just repeated the success of This War of Mine, but it went much farther. So how we did it, in both cases, is I think the answer is the same, which is we always looked at people who went through something like that. So in case of This War of Mine, of course, as I mentioned, it was reading the memoirs, listening or reading what people who actually survived a siege went through. In case of Frostpunk, of course, there was no apocalypse, but people under extreme circumstances, societies change, and we could look at how they change and how fast they change. We read a lot of scientific articles. In case of This War of Mine, including about children's psychology, there is unfortunately a rich literature. I mean, of course, it's good that we study it, but unfortunately, is that the scientists have no problem with finding the material for the studies. What war does to the child's psychic. And in case of Frostpunk, we turned to history, and we looked at the historical accounts of how societies change during extreme times of extreme strife, like plague, like famine. You don't have to really have the end of the world to see how the society changes. And for many of those people who were in those situations, it was the end of the world as they knew it. So this was our inspiration. And it turns out that societies are capable of very fast change if they need to do this to survive. And old moral norms are dumped, new ones are accepted quickly. It's not always the turn to the worse, because societies are very resilient. And they are people in extreme circumstances. Well, some extremists would like us to believe that people in extreme circumstances turn into animals. But if we ask scientists who actually are paid to study this stuff, it turns out that no, people in very difficult situations, they cooperate, they help each other, and it takes a lot to turn people against themselves, really. it takes either years of work or some drastic change. So in Frostpunk, we put the control into the hands of the player. Since we have seen this, we can take a look at Frostpunk. So that's how it looks. It's, as you can see, this is a completely different game. Completely different game than this War of Mine, but the question it poses is the same. And we, in this War of Mine, we looked at those people as some journalists said it was Sims in hell. So it's a dollhouse. We are not there. We are not inside. And in this case, we also have some distance between us and the situation. So because we wanted the player not to always be able to reflect on what to do, because not to help them not to lose control. And here we can zoom quite low to see individual people, and we hear their voices. So we are reminded that those are people. Those are not automatons. And this is the similar innovative approach as in this War of Mine. In this War of Mine, we saw that the war is not fun. It's not an adventure. It's not something you can control. And here we learn that being a ruler, being in charge is not fun. It's not to stroke your ego. It's responsibility. And the game is also difficult, quite difficult. And as in this War of Mine, it's attractive for players, because players, it turns out, they like challenges. They like to be able, I wanted to show you an example which illustrates this. And which you won't see often in another strategy game, because strategy, okay, that was it. Yeah. Strategy is about optimizing. For most people, for most players, all games are about optimizing, but the strategies particularly so. So our choices are supposed to be about doing the best thing from this a technical point of view. In this case, we have introduced, we practically turned the city, our society, into a theocracy. So the church rules, and we are the head of it. And it turns out that someone has committed suicide because they can't live in the society that we created. And his widow asks us, is it true that the priests are seeing one thing and she believes other thing, and you are the protector of the truth, you should know. And she asks us a question, why her husband had to die. And we can lie, and this is the right decision, of course, from the optimizing point of view, because it will not, if we tell the truth, we'll expose the lie that we are imposing on them. And the discontent will rise, or the hope will fall, something like that. So the right thing from the point of view of strategy is to lie, but we all know that it's wrong to lie. So our choices have brought us to the point in which to play optimally, we have to lie. And this is just an example of just one example of the choices that we have to make. Quite often the choice is between hurting our people in a short term to help them in a long term, and the choices in which we actually see that our optimizing has a moral dimension. It has moral costs. So, and just like in this war of mine, in this game, it's not that difficult to win if we shed our moral rules. So both games have been accused of nihilism because it's easy to survive if we rob people of food, if we kill, or if we turn our society into a totalitarian one. And this is true. In both games, this is so. And I don't think this is a bad thing that we showed this, because we leave the player with the question whether it was worth it. And this question, which is posed at the end of Frostpunk, if we saved our people but had to impose totalitarian controls on it, this question was criticized heavily in China. Even some newspaper for the children communist youth wrote an article about this, that the children youth is condemning Frostpunk for posing this question, because of course it was worth it. The survival of mankind is worth anything. And yes, on one hand, it's quite true, but in Frostpunk we don't have to turn our people into slaves. We don't have to win by becoming a dictator. We have a choice, and that's the question: whether we strive to do this or we choose the easy path. It's a question that we wanted to pose to players, just like in this War of Mine, and this is. Well, so I guess this is it, and I think it's time for you to ask questions of me.
Yes, here I am again.
I need to figure out how to turn off. Yeah.
Okay. I see you. I see you perfectly on the screen. I'm going to share with you some question on the screen. So this is the funny point of the lecture, because the question are going to appear on the screen, and we're going to be covered by the question on the screen. So let's go with the first question, like this. During the presentation, you focused on how game designers can design games with foresight. But what about playing with foresight? How much gaming literacy is needed, in your opinion, to approach games as players without running the risk of misunderstanding them? Do you think that such a literacy is necessary to approach games, and this war of mine in particular?
I don't think the main thing is gaming literacy, because I think yes, while the biggest part of the responsibility is on the game creators to encourage players to question the choices they made, to look at the situation from different angles, to give different perspectives, to provide in the game characters who will question what we did and ask us were there not another way. So this is all that we did. But of course, the player also has the responsibility, as with all other media, to think about what they saw. And some of us are analytical and they have to sit back and remember what they did, and only then they can discern whether their decision was right or wrong. Some of us are more emotional, and they don't do analysis. They just feel what's wrong, what's the wrong choice and what's the right choice, and saving one life now is more important than saving several later, and both approaches are valid because we are all different, but we should just try to have a wide perspective, to not to concentrate too much on games as a source, because they are still a bit or even quite narrow-minded, unfortunately. And in many games which are on one hand they seem progressive, and I don't want to name examples, but one example is I think relevant to this, and I hope my colleagues at Ubisoft won't feel offended when I bring the example of The Division, which is quite popular, and they made this game in 2016, so quite a few years ago. And we are in the game, we are fighting against some right-wingers of various kinds of shapes, but also against bandits and rioters and things like that. And if you look at this from the distance, well, this is a critique of society which fails so easily, of the state which cannot control the situation, of corrupt media, corrupt corporations, and so on and so on. But actually, if you play it, this is the right-wingers' wet dream, because this is a game, I don't know if intentionally, learns us that there is nothing you can't, there's no problem you can solve with a gun. And this is quite terrifying, especially now. I look at the United States.
I agree.
So as to recap, the responsibility is mostly of us, on the game creators, and on the game consumers, mostly to develop a broad perspective, to question the choices. But the game literacy, I don't think is quite important in this.
Okay. Another question from Valentina, this one. Did you get any criticism for the fact that you made a video game about something so dramatic? I highly respect your work, but I know that sometimes people outside the gaming community can perceive video games as offensive when they talk about serious matters. What is your experience in this matter?
Not really. I mean, what interests us is the reactions of players. There was an article in Newsweek, in Polish edition of Newsweek, because the international or American editions were full of praise. But the Polish Newsweek decided to be controversial, and they wrote an article about exploiting the war for profit. And they got a lot of pushback because this War of Mine is the last game that could be sensibly accused of profiting from war. Really, we did our homework. We were invested in this emotionally, also, and this shows. I think it shows in this game that it's not exploitative in any way. So no, not really.
Okay. One last question. Given current heavily polarized societies we are living in, do you expect to see games with less choices and more driven emotions, so to appease niches of buyers and to stir up outrage for press?
This is something that I'm afraid might happen. And yes, I think the polarization that we see mostly in American media, but in other countries too, might find its way into games. This would be a bad thing, of course. but I hope that perhaps this time the accounting department will save us, because making games which are intentionally aimed at a niche is a strategy which can work but also can backfire. Because if you are not part of that niche, you can very easily make a game that will be ridiculed by the intended audience. So I agree that this is something that we will probably see, but I hope that this will not follow the pattern we see in the United States, which is very dangerous, where we have whole media environments that can be used to shelter ourselves from these dissenting views. I intentionally try to consume, try to read opinions that are different from mine, but I know that this is difficult, and not many people do this. But the media environment kind of encourages this, and I hope that this won't happen in games. I look forward to games being inclusive in the sense that everyone can find a place in them, but not by finding the one game that conforms to my views, but by games being a reflection on reality that can be accepted by most people. So that games are not biased in the way that media often are.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I want to thank you because I think that this was a very illuminating lecture. So very important things to discuss about. So I think it was very important to speak about this game and your experience. Maybe also to have a document for the future, something that people can listen to in the future. Maybe watch this video after this lecture, and it can be helpful as well. Maybe in schools, maybe like. What is happening in Poland. So I think that our time is ended for today, but we can meet the lecturer at the in our virtual room. The link is here on screen, but you can find the link on our Facebook page and also in the comments. So thank you again, and so see you in our virtual room to have an informal chat with the public. So thanks, and I hope to see you in Italy soon, maybe.
I hope so. I've been to Italy and I love it, and I hope to visit soon. Thank you very much for having me, and
thank you. See you.
I also invite everybody to the virtual room.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.